Welcome to another edition of Dan Frequently Asked Questions. In this edition, we'll be addressing the issues of hazards versus risks. So we got a question from a diver asking us what is the difference between a hazard and a risk. Well, in simple terms, a hazard is a potential danger. In other words, it is something that has the capacity to cause harm, but harm will only result if we are exposed to that hazard. Let's use a simple example. The sun and sunlight can be hazardous, but if we are indoors, the hazard is irrelevant to us. The hazard only results in a risk when we are exposed. Now, when we calculate risk, we now need to add some additional factors. What is the probability of exposure and hence having a risk? What is the likelihood of having a serious outcome? In other words, what is the severity as well as the probability? And then finally, how treatable is whatever the complication is. So using sunburn as an example, you're in the sun for 3 hours and you acquire a bit of a sunburn, which you notice that evening, especially when you go showering. That is not a particularly significant damage or complication, if you will, of exposure to sunlight. And even though your skin is sensitive, and it may be so for the next 2 or 3 days, it's not going to reduce the quality or the length of your life. It may put you at risk eventually to skin cancer and that sort of thing, but a single exposure will not be a significant risk. So now let's take it back into diving. Is diving hazardous? Well, potentially yes. There is a hazard related to the experience of diving, being in water, breathing from a compressed gas source. All of those things represent a hazard. But if we never put our heads underwater, then it is not a risk to us because we have not been exposed to that hazard. If we do go diving, then there is a potential risk of drowning, a risk of developing decompression illness, a risk of becoming unconscious, etc., etc. If those were to happen, and there are a variety of things that could happen, what is the probability of it happening? How serious will it be if it does happen? And can it be treated if it happens? And so you can see one is ultimately able to reduce the hazard's impact on us by calculating the significance of the risk, by looking at the probability of exposure, the severity of the effect, and whether or not it can be treated or not. And you can now apply that formula to almost any situation in life, whether it's traveling by car, whether it's flying by plane, whether it's diving, whether it's taking medication and diving, and the like. And that is how we look in general at the issues of hazards versus risks. And that is why Dan has a program called Hazard Identification and Risk Assessment. So hazards need to be identified, not because they're already a risk, but because they can become a risk if we are exposed to them. A cylinder standing upright is a potential hazard. If it falls over on our foot, then the hazard has now not only become a risk, but we already now have a complication as a result of the risk. Notice the difference? The standing cylinder is a hazard, but the risk is the probability that it falls on our foot, the probability that that will result in a serious injury, in other words, probability, severity, and if it does, whether or not it is reversible and treatable fairly easily. I hope that has made the issue of hazards and risk a little bit clearer to you, and that you will be able to apply that in your regular decisions about diving. So until next time, safe diving.